Hey guys, Chris here from Kite Republic, here today to talk through the Unifoil range. Which one's better on takeoff? Which one's better for glide? Which one's better for turning, etc, etc. Now the Unifoil range is making a huge leap in the market at the moment. They've obviously came up with the first ever high aspect wing and really changed what foiling was all about. The original Hyper, and now in the release of the Progression, where does it fit in regards to the Progression, the Hyper and the Vyper, and what should I be riding for which sport? So we thought we'd start off by talking through some of the main metrics. So firstly, size for size comparisons. Then we thought we'd talk about range, so speed range. What's the stall speed and what's the top end speed between the wings? Which ones breech better? Which ones have the best pump and glide? The aspect ratio differences, where that'll help, and takeoffs. So firstly, on the surf and the managing power side of takeoffs, which one's better for that? And then on the downwind and efficiency side, which one's the best for that and how they feel differently. Finally, we thought we'd talk about power of conditions. So when the waves are big and powerful versus lighter and you're wanting more efficiency, which way to go? So just to kick things off, I thought we'll just break it into two separate areas. Firstly, obviously the Vyper is a mid-aspect, predominantly surf, but with that efficiency and ability to still link waves on. On the other side of things, we've got the Progression and the Hyper, which are just absolute weapons when it comes to efficiency. The turning of the new Progressions has been outstanding and a massive jump forwards and another evolution, like when Cliffy first came up with the Hypers and that whole idea of high aspect ratio wings to create efficiency for us. What he's done now is taken that a whole step further by giving us that same efficiency, even improving it in lots of ways, but also giving us the turning and that ability to just rip on small waves and really enjoy it and not have to sort of nurse their surfing quite so much. So let's kick into it. Firstly, size for size. Before the Progressions came out, I spent a lot of time between the Hypers and the Vypers. Absolutely loved both for different reasons, but due to getting sore hips and back at times, I found the efficiency of the Hypers outstanding on everything where I was looking to pump and looking to glide a lot more. So size for size, coming from the Hypers onto the Progressions, you can definitely jump down in sizes. So if you were riding, say, a 190 Hyper before, you're going to find the 170 Progression gives you better glide. It will give you better takeoffs and that ability to feel confident and have the foil move with you a little bit, as opposed to tracking, which all high aspect wings have done quite a lot of until now. And then obviously on the turning side, it's outstanding as well, because you're riding a smaller foil and it does have that little bit more dihedral. It just helps it get that roll and helps it move with you a little bit better. So size for size, you are 100% going to get more efficiency out of the Progression as opposed to what you did on the Hyper. I would say on the downwind side of things, coming off the 210 Hyper for our bay runs that we had here, I moved to the 200 Progression and oh my God, it was a totally different thing. I'm now resting during runs and able to surf a lot harder. So I would say that the 200 Progression is probably comparable to the 250 Hyper. The 170 Progression would be equivalent to somewhere between the 190 and the 210 in the Hyper. The 140 Progression, somewhere between the 170 and 190 in the Hyper. And then the 125 Progression, I mean, you're looking somewhere around that sort of 150 to 170 in terms of efficiency from the Hyper range. I won't compare with the Vyper because it is in a different realm in that space. So, turning. When it comes to turning, 100% in their range, the best turning wing is going to be that mid-aspect Vyper. It will turn under load, it will turn at any stage, across any crafts. Now, very close to that in my mind, and especially when you're on the smaller and the mid-size waves, the Progression has unbelievable turning. I find when you're really fast and really loaded up, I definitely prefer that Vyper feel, but for mid and smaller conditions, across prone, a little bit less power in the wing, even downwinding, etc. The Progression is for sure a step above what the Hyper is going to give you for turning. Again, when you're in that maxed out, really loaded side, that's when the Vyper's going to for sure take over, and the Hyper definitely has a space for those long drawn out accelerated turns. You find with the Hyper you get these speed bursts a little bit more. It really has that raw power and raw speed, and holds pretty well for that. When you're riding the Progression, you feel really in control, and again that allows you to ride smaller foils, and that combination of riding a smaller foil really jumps up the turning size. But size for size, even we say 210 versus 200, 210 Hyper 2 versus 200 Progression, I'm going to choose the Progression for turning every single time. Moving on to their Breeching. Same thing, the Hypers, you can get the slightest little bit of breach and get back, and some guys out there can obviously get a bit more than that. With the Progression, you will feel a heck of a lot better when you're breaching the tip. When you look at the difference in the tips, you'll see the Progression actually has a slight flip at the end, so it's actually made to be able to breach better, just to change that interaction between water and air that we'll see on a regular tip. We'll see the air really shooting down and just blowing up the wing, whereas it just find on the Progression I've been a lot more comfortable when breeching, and it makes a big difference. So definitely the Progression when it comes to breeching. All right, pump and glide. So both of these wings are exceptional in that space. The Hyper 2 was my go-to for a really long time compared to anything else out there. There are other wings that are higher aspect, longer and flatter, that will pump and glide a little bit better than these if they're that higher aspect ratio wing and made for that. The problem is they don't turn, and they're not much fun to ride, so you're really giving up a lot. That's why I found the perfect interaction between pump and glide, turning, and lots of different usages, the Hyper 2s. As soon as I got onto the Progressions, apart from testing back-to-backs, I'm not putting the Hyper 2 back on in that space. The Progressions definitely glide better. It lets me rest between glides. It basically has a much lower stall speed, so I can ride slower and still be gliding and confident. And then as you're pumping, you've got a little bit more front foot pressure almost. It feels like you've got more to press off as you're going, which gives you that real confidence and allows you to have that real feeling of being in control and efficient. Once you do get that little bit slower, you can recover it really easily. I found with the Hyper 2s, compared to anything else out there, they were excellent until the Progression came along. However, once I got too slow, I would find I had to be super light and fast almost to try to get up there, or else I could push it through the water still a little bit, whereas the Progressions just give you that room for error and it feels fantastic. So pump and glide, 100% going to the Progression, even on a smaller size to what the Hypers I was riding before were. All right, stall speed, already talked about that. The Progression is a no-brainer. Heaps lower stall speed, super easy to glide at slow rates compared to what the Hypers were. And again, the Hypers weren't bad in that space. They were pretty good, but the Progression, slightly higher aspect ratio, slightly wider tips, and that foil section through the middle's just got a little bit more beef in it and a little bit more secret sauce, I guess. Cliff, let us know the secrets, man. So that just allows you to glide at lower speeds and to pump really well. So the stall speed on the Progression is definitely better than the Hyper. All right, so talking about top end of speed and speed range, what will go faster? Now, this is the only time out of the two wings in all my testing, the only thing I think the Hyper 2 will just go slightly faster for size in terms of just pure straight line speed. Back-to-backing the two, they're pretty comparable. The Hyper just has this feeling of that little extra bit of slipperiness through the water. At the high speeds, it feels like you get a little bit more out of the Hyper 2, but it's very close. Whereas the Progression, again, you can ride it smaller, so you can definitely get the same speed. So in terms of top speed, incredibly close, maybe just slightly to the Hyper 2 over the Progression. All right, talking about the aspect ratio, definitely the Progressions do have a wider wingspan for size compared to the Hyper 2s. If we say the 170, because that's one that they've both got in the same size, the 170 has an aspect ratio of 7.7 in the Hyper 2 and a wingspan of 920 millimeters, whereas in the Progression, the 170 has a aspect ratio of 8.3 and it has a wingspan of 953. So a little bit wider for the Progression compared to the Hyper, and yeah, So it's going to be that little bit more efficient. However, with the dihedral and with the new foil section, the roll and turning is definitely better. So there's so many bonuses on that side. Now, takeoffs. There are two sides to takeoffs. One is the surf and managing power side of takeoffs, and the other one is the efficiency and downwind style of takeoff. So let's start with the surf and managing power. I definitely prefer the feeling of takeoffs on the progression. And that was first session in. So I'd been riding the Hyper and Hyper2 for years, but the first takeoffs, same thing. The Vyper was very good when I first jumped on that too, and still is. But the feeling of the progression, the first waves I got on it, straight away I felt comfortable. And the reason being, I think, with the Hyper2, it doesn't have quite the same dihedral, I don't believe, and doesn't roll quite as well. So if you're not completely centered on the board on your takeoff, or not even centered on the board, but have your balance centered in the right spot, and you're coming off to the side, like a surfboard, the progression allows it to come around and actually go with you, whereas the Hyper2 tends to track in more of a straight line in that situation. So definitely on the takeoffs, I find that confidence I get of if I'm off center, the foil's going to allow it to come around with me a little bit, makes a huge difference and just inspires confidence. The other part of that, the progression is just slightly meatier and holds between about here and here through that foil section. It seems to hold just a little bit more volume, which to me makes it feel like there's a lot more forgiveness. So I don't have to balance coming up. I can pretty much get on and stomp it up if I want to. Whereas moving over to, you know, the standard high aspect feel out there, you have to be a little bit careful coming up, especially on smaller sizes, or you can stall the foil quite easily. The progression gets around that and makes everything easier. So it's a very easy wing, I'd say, even to learn on. It's an easy wing to ride, and for the takeoffs, it inspires confidence. So 100% I would go the progression for managing power and surf takeoffs. On the other side of things, the downwind takeoffs and where you need efficiency and to balance that stalling at lower speeds. As we talked about on an earlier part of the video, the progression definitely has a lower stall speed and allows you to be up and riding in that space better. So that's one part of why the takeoffs are a lot easier on the progression. The other one is that with the Hyper, I find if you really stomp on the back, on the smaller sizes in particular, it can come up, but then you're stalling. Whereas with the progression, you've got a lot more room for error, and it tends to want to help you out like a more sort of mid aspect or low aspect wing. So it's got that real feeling of forgiveness. I think the name progression, it's perfect for what it is, because it really just inspires you and allows you to progress a lot easier. And it's little things like this, like the takeoffs being easier, like when you're off center, it comes around with you. On the downwind takeoffs, for me, it's the fact that as soon as I can kick it off the water, I don't have to be quite so careful with keeping it flat, and I can get up and riding a lot quicker and chase those bumps I want to. So on the downwind side as well, definitely the progression over the Hyper2. And then finally, managing power. So when you're in bigger surf, when you're towing, when you're wing foiling with lots more power, freestyle riding and really load it up, 100% standout in that space is the Vyper. The Vyper is outstanding for managing power. It is what it's built for. You can turn that thing when you're completely loaded and be really confident with that. However, out of the Hyper and the Progression, I'd say they're both, as I said, they're both very close. The Hyper's probably got slightly more just pure raw speed and that sort of wanting to take off feel about it, whereas the Progression, you can ride smaller. So size for size, be very close. You might slightly go to the Hyper. However, I would say because you can go smaller, the Progression turns better to get the same efficiency for the pump and the rest. You'd lean that way. So again, I would go a slightly smaller size on the Progression as opposed to going a Hyper, and still feel like I had better pump and turning out of that. So this one is close, depends on the feel you're after. If you're wanting to be able to still turn it well and have it go with you in your leaning, go the Progression. If you're used to riding straight and fast and you turn from the hips and pivot a lot more, then you probably find them fairly balanced and maybe a slight bit of raw speed from the Hyper. Hope that helps with the different parts there. In terms of those sports, putting all of that into basic words, prone and SUP surfing, Number one for smaller and mid waves, 100% is going to be the Progression. Once we get up into sizable waves, I'm balancing that between either really small Progression, small to mid, maybe Hyper for those that are used to that feel, or no brainer once there's more power around. The Vyper is still an outstanding wing that is built for handling power. Whereas these other two, the Hyper and the Progression, are going to give you that efficiency, with the Progression allowing it to be a bit easier and to be able to turn better and rest more and pump a little bit easier as well. So Progression still super hard to beat in that space. For the wing guys, if you're loaded, if you're wanting freestyle, if you're doing that, number one, Vyper. Number two, I would say smaller on the Progression side, and then the Hyper for those wanting to hold speed and straight line speed, just a little bit more towards the Hyper. And then for those that are wanting to downwind wing or ride smaller bumps or waves, I'm going to be going straight to the Progression on that side of things. Finally, for the kiteboarders out there, I mean, for kiting, you cannot beat a Vyper. They're outstanding. They turn really well. And still hold that efficiency, so you can take a fair bit of power out of the actual kite and still be riding and playful in that space. And in saying that, obviously we've got a 125 Progression, and the Progression, that's an 800 square centimetre wing, or just over 800 square centimetre wing, that's going to work really well. It's going to hold speed brilliantly. Probably not quite going to get the loaded turning of what you're going to get on the Vyper, but compared to any other high aspect or really quick wing out there, that's going to be a really good option as well. And yeah, I'd say Hypers, you can definitely get out there and kite the smaller sizes. You're going to have great straight line speed. You're probably not going to have amazing turning when you've got a bit of a load up as well though. So hope this helps with decision making, guys. We are so happy to talk about this versus other brands versus other things. I test just about everything out there and absolutely love this area of the sport. So hit us up, kiterepublic.com.au. Cheers guys.